Hi everyone, I'm Celine from Blue Calla Patterns and welcome to the final video for the Strawflower Convertible bag. We're going to start by assembling our zipper panel. So I'll show you what that looks like on the bag. So what we're putting together right now is this portion right here. Now, even if you're really precise with cutting your pieces and making sure that they're all the same size, depending on the fabric that you're using, it can be a little bit tricky to make sure that when you're attaching these pieces to the zipper, that the edges here at the top and the bottom, that they line up perfectly for all of the pieces. Sometimes your fabric will have a little bit of stretch and that can cause some issues. So what you can do, I know some like to use a double-sided tape in order to make sure that the pieces do not move at all. So you can do that. You'll want to use a really thin tape. Let me see if I have it. So you'll want to use, so this is a 1/4 inch tape. I think you can get it in 1/8 of an inch, but I'm not sure. So you want to use something really thin like this one, 1/4 inch. So that is up to you if you want to do that. And that will make sure that the pieces don't shift. So we're going to be attaching them like this, right? So you want these edges here to not move around and to be perfectly aligned when the zipper panel is all sewn together. So double-sided tape, that is an option. Another option, if you don't have double-sided tape or you're a little bit afraid of gumming up your needle, just use a lot of pins or clips, like lots, and just don't remove them until you're sewing right where they are, like where they're located. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's another option. One thing that I also like to do to avoid movement is to baste the zipper to the lining piece first and then attach the exterior piece. So there's a few different ways to approach it. Just use whichever method that you feel most comfortable with. So the first thing we're going to do is just baste that zipper to one of the zipper panel lining pieces. And this, you're just doing a quick basting stitch, and you're going to use 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now, always when you're sewing by a zipper pull, you should make sure to take it out of the way because it does make the zipper curve out a bit where the slider is. Okay, so that's basted to the lining piece, and now here's where you would use your double-sided tape if that's what you were comfortable with. I'm going to try to do it without and just use a lot of clips, so wish me luck. Now, if I was not using faux leather in waterproof canvas, I would probably be using pins because I find pins are a lot better for holding things in place than clips are. Okay, so now we're going to the machine and we're going to sew through all the layers. This time we're going to use a regular stitch length and we're going to use 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure that you back stitch at the beginning and the end. Okay, so I've sewn through all of the layers. Now let's see if I did a good job having the ends in the same spot. I think it looks okay. Now, if I was using fabric, which at this stage I really wish that I was, because it's so much easier to do this if you can press these layers away from the zipper before top stitching. But unfortunately, I'm using material that doesn't allow me to press. So what I'll do instead is I like to line up the edges like this, because I don't want to top stitch and they're uneven at the edges here. So I use clips and I hold them together like this. And then as I'm top stitching, I'm kind of pulling them apart like this and then top stitching this seam allowance here. And when I top stitch here, I use a seam allowance of 1/8 of an inch. Okay, so these two panels are attached. I managed to line them up beautifully. This doesn't happen often. And now I'm going to do the same thing for these two pieces, attaching them to this side of the zipper. Now, again, I'm going to start by basting this to this piece. And again, we want to make sure that these edges here are nicely aligned, okay? That's really important. It just makes the final assembly so much easier if you can ensure that everything is aligned nicely. Okay, just double checking that these are nicely aligned. Looks good. And I'm going to do the same now to attach this exterior piece. Okay, and these two are attached now. And I'm doing the same thing, clipping the edges and then top stitching. Okay, so that's all assembled. Everything is lined up really nicely. So now we're going to do the final assembly. So you're going to need everything that you've sewn up so far. So your exterior and your lining gusset, your zipper panel, and then you're going to need also your main body panels. And before we start any sort of assembly, what we're going to do is we're going to mark some little boxes, because when we're sewing everything together, I'll show you on the finished bag, in order to make the corners here not look all puckered, we can't sew all the way to the ends, to the corners. So we are going to be starting and stopping the sewing 3/8 of an inch, which is our seam allowance, away from every corner. So first, let's make the 3/8 of an inch boxes. And maybe what I'll do, so normally I would, in the pattern, I get you to do all of these marks all at once, but I think it'll be simpler or a little bit more clear if I just start with the main body and the zipper panels, okay? So let's set aside our gussets for now. And you're going to need a fabric pen and a ruler. Again, I wish I had a smaller ruler, but I do not. Okay, so you're going to take a ruler. A clear ruler really is best for this. These are my main body lining pieces, and on the wrong side, you know what, I'm going to have to get a newer ruler because my little marks have completely disappeared. This is a well-loved ruler. Okay, I got this smaller ruler, and thankfully all the lines are still there. So we want to do 3/8 of an inch boxes. And you know what, even if you do 1/2 an inch, that's also fine. So if you find it easier to do 1/2 an inch, you could do 1/2 an inch. Okay, so you're just doing little boxes like this. Hopefully you could see that. And you're doing this only at the top corners. You don't need to do them anywhere else. So for now, we're just doing it on the main body pieces and the zipper panel. So these are, we haven't really seen these because we don't sew anything to them. So these are my exterior pieces. Oops. Now, if we didn't do this and we sewed all the way from end to end, you would have these really horrible looking puckered corners at the top of the bag. And when you're doing this assembly, I would not rush it. Take your time. Make sure that you do a good job sewing these together, and you'll really enjoy the final result a lot better than if you had puckered corners. You would not love those. Okay, so now I'm doing these boxes on the wrong side of all of the zipper panel pieces. So both of the lining pieces and both of the exterior pieces as well. This will kind of make sense once we start assembling. I'm going to put something heavy here. It keeps flipping in the way. Okay, like this. Now you might not be able to see this on camera. It's a little bit dark. Okay, so we have all of these boxes drawn on the wrong side now. And I'm going to start by attaching lining pieces together. Now in the pattern, I think I'm attaching exterior pieces together. It does not matter. We're going to have to attach all of them. So it really doesn't matter which ones you start with. So these are the same length here at the top. This does angle outwards a little bit, so it might look like it's off, but it's actually going to line up. So I'm not attaching this to this exterior zipper panel piece. This is the main body lining piece being attached to one of the lining zipper panel pieces. So once I clip this all together, I'm going to show you what I'll lift it up and I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, so that's what it looks like. So this will be the interior of our bag, and then that will be hidden inside. Okay, so I'm only attaching the lining pieces together, the lining zipper panel to the top edge of the main body lining piece. And so here's where the boxes come into play. So I'm going to start sewing, and maybe what I'll do is I'll do the purple line where I'm going to be sewing. Got my clips in the way now. And it doesn't work. It's very pale. You might not see it. Okay. Anyways, so when we are sewing, we're sewing along the purple line. So we're starting at this, the point here, the corner of this box here. We're going to backstitch, and then we're going to sew all the way across, maintaining a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch. And then when we get to this corner of the box, we're going to backstitch a little bit and then stop sewing. So you're not sewing this portion and this portion of the seam. So one thing is, I mentioned this at the beginning, if you use stretchy fabric, you're going to probably have problems in this step. So you'll need to really be careful with that. My Ultra Glide foot here helps a little bit with stickiness, but if you're really, really struggling and you have a walking foot for your machine, use a walking foot in this step. Okay, so that's what it looks like, and you'll see this part here and this part here has not been sewn together. So that's what that looks like. And now I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to attach the other main body lining piece to the other zipper panel exactly the same way. Okay, so now these two are sewn with gaps at the ends. Okay, now we're going to do exactly the same thing for the exterior. So I'm just going to push the lining away. I'm going to take one of my main body exterior pieces, and I'm doing exactly what I just did previously. Okay, so wasn't very precise with my cutting, so I'm just going to center it nicely. So I think I cut my main body exterior piece a little bit wider than it should be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop a little bit before the box. So if you've done that same mistake as I have, that's what you can do to fix it. Okay, so now that one's attached, and I'm just pushing everything out of the way. I'm going to attach this one now. Okay, so that's what it looks like from looking at the exterior pieces. And this is what it looks like looking at the lining pieces.
This is an optional step, but if you'd like, you can press the seam allowance towards the main body exterior piece and top stitch. Again, only top stitching between the 3/8 of an inch boxes and making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end.
So now one thing that I forgot to do that we're going to do now, it's not a big deal, is we're going to mark our bottom centers on all of our main body pieces. Now you can actually use the pattern piece to do this. You don't have to do this acrobatic folding that I am doing because I forgot to do this step. So definitely I would say using the pattern piece is probably easier than what I'm doing now. So you just want the bottom center piece. And this is just to make sure that we're centering the gusset properly. Okay, so before we attach the gusset pieces, we have to do those little boxes, same as we did for the other pieces. Okay, and we are just doing these on the wrong side. Okay, and then we're going to do the same for the exterior gusset. So our little handles are here and they might be a little bit in the way. So we will just do our best. Okay, and I'm going to set this one aside for now. We're going to attach the lining gusset first. Okay, so when I attach, I'm just taking one of the main body lining pieces. I have that face on top here facing me, wrong side facing up. And then that center mark that we made at the bottom, we're going to line that up with the center seam of the gusset. And then I like to pin or clip this way and then just sort of wrap the gusset around the edges. So when you're doing a curved edge like this, do the center and then the top corners next. Make sure that you have a lot of clips or pins handy. Okay, and then we're going to pin clip the rest between those first two clips. Now, When you're attaching the gusset lining, of course, we want it to not be too baggy. So on a structured bag, this matters a lot more. But I find on a soft-bodied bag, it doesn't really, like, no matter what, your lining ends up looking a little bit bunched up in there. It's just kind of the nature of a soft-bodied bag. But we are going to use a bigger seam allowance. So you'll see that there's kind of these ripples in the gusset, and you're thinking, okay, the gusset is too small to accommodate the edges of the main body pieces. This is actually done intentionally, and it will prevent puckers. And I'll show you when we're sewing. What I'll probably do to make it easier to show you is start sewing from the bottom center here up towards one corner. And when we're sewing along these corners, I'm going to have a pair of scissors handy. And what I'm going to do is clip little notches in the gusset so that it spreads out and accommodates the rounded edge of the main body piece. So that will I'll show you on the machine. It's kind of hard to explain it. It's better if I just show you. So now I'm going to pin clip the other side. Okay, so I leave this part here where I know there's going to be puckers. I leave that last. And what I just do is I kind of evenly distribute the main body panel. And so I do middles, 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 if that makes any sense. Always pinned in the middle and then kind of spread out the what seems like excess fabric between that. This will make sense in a minute, I promise. Okay, so that's what that looks like now. And when I go to the machine and sew, I'm actually going to sew with the main body on the bed of the machine so that I can have access to the gusset to do those notches that I mentioned.
Okay, so I have my pair of scissors handy here. I'm starting from the bottom center mark. And we're going to sew with the regular seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch just to do this part here, the easing in of the gusset part. And then I'm going to sew a second time and use a slightly larger seam allowance. Now keep your needle in the down position when you're doing this part. Okay, and so I'm getting to the part where you see seems like there's excess of the main body. I'm going to get a little closer, remove this clip, and here's where I start. You need to do the notches smaller than the seam allowance. So I do maybe 1/4 inch deep. And then you'll see it allows the fabric to kind of spread out and take in that excess main body piece. Again, same thing. See, I have this, it seems like an excess. So I'm not clipping the main body at all. I'm only clipping the gusset. And again, again. And then when we get to the top corners here, you'll remember the boxes. So we're not sewing all the way to the top corners. We're going to stop here at the corner of the box and backstitch.
Okay, so there's one half sewn, no puckers. Now we're going to do the same thing with the other side. This time I am going to start here. I don't want to flip it over because it's going to make it very hard for me to cut my notches.
So again, make sure that you're starting at the corner of the box and backstitch. Now here we have our zipper pocket, so when we're doing notches, we're going to be doing them through the pocket as well. Okay, now when you get to the stitches where we started sewing the first side, make sure that you overlap them a bit and backstitch.
Okay, so now that we've sewn this together with the usual 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, we're going to go along a second time, and this time we're going to start at our seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch, and then we're going to increase to 1/2 an inch until we get approximately to the 1 inch below the corner of the box, and then return to 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so we have the gusset sewn to one of the main body pieces, and now we're going to sew it to the other main body piece. This time here we're going to do it a little bit differently. We need to leave an opening to turn the bag. Now normally I would do this through the bottom of a zipper pocket, but unfortunately the pocket that we've sewn here, I did find it a slightly too narrow and I didn't want to tear anything, so we're going to turn through the lining for this bag. And I will not walk you through it, but this is done exactly as we did the first part. So I am going to sew this part exactly as I did previously, but I'm going to mark out an area that is 6 inches. So I'm just doing the mark at the beginning and the end. So I'm not going to be starting right at the center this time. I'm going to be starting about 3 inches from that center and stopping 3 inches from the center on this side, and that'll leave us a 6-inch gap for turning. Okay, so I've sewn the second side of the gusset to the other main body lining piece, and I have my opening here that I'm going to use to turn the bag later. But again, since we're attaching a lining piece, we want to do this seam again and increase to 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now we will be trimming the seam allowance, but we're going to do that at the very end when all of the gusset pieces, the gusset is attached to all of the main body pieces. Just before we turn the bag, that's when we're going to trim seam allowances. Okay, so this is what our bag looks like now. Okay, there's our lining shell. So now we're going to repeat the same exact steps as we just did. The only thing is we're not leaving it an opening for turning. We're not going to be doing that, obviously, because it's the exterior of our bag. And also we're going to be staying within the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance.
Before attaching the gusset to the main body pieces, make sure that your zipper pulls for both of your zipper pockets are away from the side so you don't accidentally sew them in the seam.
Okay, so the exterior gusset is attached to one of the main body pieces, and now we're just going to do the same thing for this one.
Before continuing, partially open your main zipper closure so that you're able to turn your bag right side out when assembly is finished.
Okay, so this is what the bag looks like now. It's a little bit difficult. It's a very large bag, so it's a bit difficult for me to show the whole thing on camera. Okay, so everything is closed up except for the ends here at the top where our handles are connected. So that's what we're going to sew shut now. So it can be a little bit tricky to do this part just because you have to line up 3 layers and sew them together. And then you also need to only sew again between the corners of those boxes that we drew on the wrong side. So I usually start with 1 bit at a time. Actually, there are 4 layers here that we have to line up and sew together. So get all of your clips ready. First, we're going to, so what I do is the main panels here is I kind of fold their corner in half like this. Okay, and then I line up that little corner with the corner of the lining zipper panel and the lining gusset. So see how all of the corners are lined up, and then I will clip that together. And then I'll do the same for this corner. Okay, all 3 corners are together, and I use a clip to hold it. And then I want to make sure that my zipper is lying flat. So I'm including the lining gusset in, the lining zipper panels in this as well. I mean the exterior zipper panels. So that is like that now. And then again at these corners, so I'm folding the corner of the main body in half and then lining up those corners with the top corners here of the gusset and the zipper panel exterior pieces and putting a clip there. So this is a bit tricky to make sure you have everything lined up, but it's better to take your time and unclip and reclip until you're happy as opposed to just going ahead and sewing and making a mistake. So go ahead and be a little picky with your clipping. So now all I did was flattened all the layers and then use this clip that you used for your lining pieces and then get all 4 layers. Now before I sew this together, just going to again remove one of the clips here at the corners, make sure they're all lined up, and then just use 1 clip to hold all 4 layers together. Okay, and then I'm going to go over to the machine and I'm going to sew from the corner of this little box all the way to the corner of this little box, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end.
Now when you're sewing this part, make sure that you keep your needle in the down position. Now, if you'd like to make the area where your handles are stronger, you can sew them a second time once we've sewn the seam 1 time. So, hopefully you can see that. I do have some threads there, but I sewn from the corner of that box to the corner of that box. And because I want the handle area to be extra strong, I'm going to sew that a second time just at the handles, and I'm going to sew it about 1/8 of an inch from the original seam towards the outside.
Okay, so that's sewn together. We're going to do the same thing now for the other top corner. Now, before I trim all my seam allowances, I'm actually going to turn the bag right side out and have a look at what the handles and the corners look like. They are going to pucker because I haven't trimmed the seam allowances yet, but before I commit, I do like to have a look. So mostly what I'm looking for is to make sure that there's no hole. But if you've sewn properly from the corner of the box to the corner of the box on every seam, it should be fine. You should not have a hole. Okay, so that all looks fine. Now we are going to trim the seam allowances. And there's one thing that I would like to do, and that is tack the top edges of the main body pieces together. So the exterior and the lining pieces together. So you can do this by hand. You can do it with the machine. I like to do it with the machine. It's just a lot faster. And you don't have to tack the whole thing. You can just do a section of it. And what I like to do is follow the current seam on the exterior when I do this. So you're just going to sew again along that seam here at the top of the main body panel.
Now make sure that you don't go this on this side of the seam.
Okay, and the reason why we're doing this is so that uh, the lining doesn't fall into the bag at all. It just keeps the sides of the main body pieces together nicely at the top edge. I'm doing the same thing on the other side. And I'm just doing this because it's easier to do it now before we trim all the seam allowances. Okay, and now we can trim the seam allowances. The most important part is actually these top corners. We want to cut away some of this bulk, otherwise our corners are really going to pucker terribly. But the important thing is to not cut any of our stitches in our seams. So take your time, do not rush through this part. Just go at it very slowly. If you do accidentally cut, make sure that you just re-sew where you've cut stitches before you continue at all. Okay, so you want to do that. Now, I don't trim seam allowance where my handles are because I'm just afraid that's going to weaken that area of the bag. But then I do trim everything else. So there are a lot of seams to trim. Just take your time and trim them all. Do not trim where you have your handles. And if you cut your zipper, make sure that you re-seal the end, the cut end, with heat. And then where I have zipper pocket zippers, I don't trim that either. So don't forget you have 2 zipper pockets on the exterior. There's my zipper area, not trimming that area. So when you get to this seam in your lining, you have your opening here. Do not trim anything at the opening. And actually, I would stop trimming about an inch before and after that opening. And then again, in your zipper pocket in the lining, do not trim the ends of your zipper. Okay, so now you're going to reach through that opening in your lining, and I always start by pulling the bottom of my exterior because that's going to be the trickiest part to get through the opening. Okay, so this is what the bag looks like. Now we're going to close the opening in the lining. So because it's a seam allowance of 1/2 inch, leaves us a lot of fabric to be able to fold in and then sew that shut. So you can sew this shut by machine or by hand, whatever method you prefer. Okay, so I'm going to just go over to the machine and sew this opening shut. And I use so I try to sew as close to the folded edges as I possibly can, making sure that I get both layers in the seam, and I backstitch at the beginning and the end. Okay, so this is what the bag looks like now. Zipper pocket here, zipper pocket there. And the last thing that we are going to do is attach our shoulder strap. So I chose to do the permanent shoulder strap, which means that I'm going to have to sew my shoulder strap, the webbing cuffs. So we're going to do that first. And then I will show you how to do the removable shoulder strap with the hardware. Okay, so since I'm doing the permanent strap, I'm going to need my webbing and my webbing cuffs. So turn your webbing cuffs so that they are wrong side facing up. And then in the middle, on the wrong side, you're going to draw a line. So because they are 3 inches, you're going to draw this line at 1.5 inches. Do the same for this one. Okay. Now, if you're using fabric, you'd be able to fold in both halves and press them. So you're folding in both halves towards that center line and pressing them. Since I'm using something that cannot be pressed, unfortunately, I'm not able to do that. So what I'm going to do instead is go to the machine and fold in half and then sew along the outer edge with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And I'm going to do that for both sides. Okay, so that's what that should look like now. I'm going to do the same for the second. Okay, so now you're going to take one of the webbing cuffs and you're going to fold it in half this way. And this is the right side with no raw edges, and this is the wrong side. So you want it right sides together, like this. And then we're going to sew here with 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we're sewing the raw ends together. Okay, so now you're going to need your bag and your two webbing cuffs and your shoulder strap webbing piece. And you're going to pass one end from the outside of the bag in towards the center. And then take one of the webbing cuff pieces and flip it so that it is right side facing out. Okay, this. And then flatten it and insert your strap end inside the cuff. Okay, like this. And then just put it around, wrap it around your handle, and then insert the end into the cuff again. Now, this will vary depending on the thickness of your webbing, how much of the strap to put through. So some webbings can actually be very, very thick. So I'm going to shorten mine just a bit. So you want this to slide easily on the strap. And you want your enough, I would have this end of the webbing about three quarters of the way up through the cuff. And then I try to have the seam of the cuff centered on the inside. So you'll see on looking at the outside of the bag, you don't see the seam. So you want the seam to be on the inside here. Okay, and then I'm just going to use clips to hold that in place. And you're going to sew this together all the way around the edges of the cuff, and make sure that you backstitch a little bit where you start and stop. And then if you like, you can actually add some rivets here to give extra support, but also it's a nice decorative element. And then for the other side, we're doing the same thing. So make sure that your shoulder strap is not twisted. Insert this end this way. Flip your webbing cuff so that it is right side facing out. Now, before you sew this in place, you may want to use a bit of fabric glue in between the layers. So I would put it on both sides of the webbing cuff just to give some extra strength to the strap. Although if you're using rivets, you don't really need to do the glue. So it's up to you. I'm going to add rivets later. So I'm going to skip the glue. Okay, so making sure this isn't twisted, sliding my webbing through the cuff. So I purposely made the webbing cuff to be quite a snug fit because I don't want it to be all floppy or stick out past the sides of the strap. Okay, like this. And you want that to be on the outside. And then wrap this around again and then stick it back inside the cuff. Now, before you sew all of this in place, this is a good time to check that you're happy with the length of your shoulder strap. Maybe you want to carry the bag crossbody instead of over one shoulder, in which case you're going to need to cut a longer piece of webbing. So just before you sew anything or glue anything, make sure that you're really happy with the length of the shoulder strap. Okay, that looks good. So I also like to do a comparison because I want these to be the same. That looks good. And use clips to hold this in place, and then again I'm sewing that webbing cuff with a square box of stitching. If you would like to make it extra secure, you can even do the square box of stitching with an X in the middle. That would also make it really strong. So if you don't have glue or you don't want to set rivets, a box and then an X inside, that's pretty secure as well. Okay, so there's the shoulder strap just held on with clips, and now we're going to sew the webbing cuffs in place. I like to sew with this side facing forward since that's going to be the view that most people will see, and that way there you can really make an effort to do the nice box of stitching on the right side.
Now, when you sew the webbing cuff on, make sure that you leave your needle in the down position, and that'll help you to rotate at the corners.
Okay, so that is the permanent shoulder strap attached. Now we're going to work on the version with the hardware. So if you're doing the version with hardware, you're going to need your swivels. And you're also going to need your shoulder strap piece. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is draw a line through the center on the wrong side, the entire length. So since the strap is 3 inches wide, we know that 1.5 inches is the center. Now, before we sew the ends of the strap together to make a loop, you're going to slip your strap through the rings of your swivels like this. And then making sure your strap is not twisted, you're going to place the ends right sides together like this. And then you're going to sew a diagonal seam from this corner all the way up to this corner here. So what I'll do is I'll just clip them together. And then I find it easier if I just draw the line where I need to sew. So from here to here. Okay, so then I'm going to sew along that diagonal line. Okay, and just make sure it's good. Now you're going to trim that seam allowance to 1/4 inch. Now, if you want, you can open up that seam allowance and then top stitch along both sides with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so now we have a loop with 2 swivels. And now what we're going to do is we're going to fold in each half of this shoulder strap loop. So you're going to fold in each half towards that center line, and you're going to sew it in place with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance away from that center line. Now, if it was fabric, I could press both halves and then sew it down, but because I'm using something that can't be pressed, I'm just going to fold and sew at the machine as I go.
So when I get to the stitching where I started, I'm actually going to continue sewing. I don't want to backstitch and stop sewing on this side, but I need to do the second side. So what I usually do is I wait till I get to a seam and then I move over to the other side. Like this. And then I just repeat the same thing for the other side.
Okay, so you now have this loop with 2 swivels. You want to flip the loop so that the raw edges are inside, like this. And then you're going to take the swivels, make sure that they're both facing the exterior. So you want the ring part to be inside where you have the raw edges, this. Okay. And then decide where you want to have your seam. So I usually place it close to one of my swivels like this. Okay, so now you're going to sew this together. So you're flattening the loop, and you can use, I actually don't clip the whole thing because I find no matter what, the fabric is going to shift a little bit. So I just use a few to hold them together. And then we're going to sew these layers together by sewing a large rectangle box. So you're going to sew across here. Try to get as close as you can without hitting your rings from your swivels, and then all the way along this side, and then across, and then all along this side. And make sure to backstitch a little bit where you at the beginning and the end. Overlap the stitches as well a little bit. And then you will have your completed shoulder strap.
So when you're sewing this part, you should be sewing with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the outer edges.
Okay, so that is the completed shoulder strap. You could go ahead and add some rivets here if you like. Now, of course, this is the permanent strap version, but if you were using this, if you were making this version with the hardware, you would not have this strap attached. You'd actually have an O-ring on each of these handles, this one, and then you would just be clipping the strap on each of the O-rings. So that's the end of our video series. I hope that you enjoyed making the straw flower, and I can't wait to see everyone's photos of their completed bags.